The research was commissioned by the TUC and Unions21 to build upon and update a number of other pieces of research that the TUC and some specific unions have commissioned over the last several years. What we wanted to do was to understand the views of young people about unions in general, about recruitment and the appeal of unions. We did ask them to look at some current recruitment materials. We also want to understand their views about the public sector cuts and about the deficit in general, and also a word that's been used quite a lot this morning already, fairness. What does fairness mean to them? So I'm going to try and give you a run through of findings along all of those things. Had budgets been larger for the project, we would have probably loved to do a range of different surveys, quantitative work and so on, but what this research is a qualitative piece of work only. It was 3 discussion groups, all with young people aged between 16 and 24, and one group was in London, and it was with all young people employed in the private sector. One group was held in Coventry, and was with all young people employed in the public sector, and the third group was held in Sheffield, and was all with students, but also they were mostly part-time employed, as most students are. So just to give you an idea of what we actually did. What I'm going to cover, as I've already mentioned briefly, is we started the discussion with some questions about workplace issues. What are the issues that they find in the workplace? What are the things that concern them or worry them? And then we moved on to talk to them about their top-of-mind perceptions with regard to trade unions. When we say the words trade union, what does that make you think of? So I'll share with you what they said about that. We went on to explore a bit more detail. What are the barriers to joining unions? What makes people feel that a union isn't for them? What are the things that might be drivers towards unions as well? And so some of the views about how to overcome some of the barriers that we uncovered. As I said, we looked at some recruitment materials, so I've got some findings about communications and how you might communicate with young people. And finally, I'll also cover some of the findings about the public sector cuts and fairness. Okay, as I mentioned, we're starting with workplace issues. As a sort of warm-up to the discussions about unions, and before we'd revealed who the research was for, we asked people what issues they had at work. And the 3 groups were quite different in terms of the issues that arose. Perhaps not surprisingly, given that we had this mix of private sector, young people working in the private sector, young people working in the public sector, and young students. The issues that came from the first group, which is was held in London with people who were all employed in the private sector, there weren't very many issues coming forward. In fact, they were pretty content. What they said was they felt it quite difficult to imagine workplace issues that they couldn't easily raise with their manager or with their HR department. That even when probed, they did talk about, actually there haven't been any pay rises in my company, and actually there's no prospect of promotion at the moment. But what they tended to do was accept that and say, well, you know, I haven't bothered to ask for a pay rise. One young man said, just because I know they're struggling, so it isn't really going to happen, and that there's not much point in me asking. So I guess you just accept the situation as it is. You accept those things. And so in the private sector, they really struggled to come up with anything that was particularly bothering them at work. And when we asked them, where would you go if you did have an issue in the workplace, if you did have some kind of problem or felt that you'd been treated unfairly? Unfortunately, young people in the private sector certainly didn't think of unions as a place to turn. But in any case, as I say, they tended to sort of accept their workplace and feel pretty happy. The public sector group obviously was different. There were lots of concerns in the workplace, as you'd expect in the current climate. But for the most part at the moment, I think Ed Balls refers to this moment, actually what's happening, it's not very clear what's going to happen to them at the moment. And most of the young people that I spoke to who are working in the public sector were saying, I know something's bad is about to happen, I am worried, But actually, at the moment, I don't know how bad it's going to be for me or for my colleagues, and I'm just waiting to see, really. And at the moment, I don't really feel there's much I can do. I've just got to wait and see. They did complain they didn't know, they weren't really being kept informed about cuts and what might happen to them, so they felt that they were being kept a bit in the dark. But again, they were sort of basically saying, I think we'll just have to wait and see. There's no clarity here. We'll see what happens over the next few months. And to some extent, we're sort of hopeful that there wouldn't be too much in the way of redundancies that weren't voluntary. So some people are hoping that they wouldn't be placed in particularly difficult situations. The third group, the Sheffield group with the students, were the group that did feel vulnerable to bad treatment, and many of them did tell me stories of bad treatment in the workplace. They mostly had part-time jobs in catering or retail sectors, and quite a number of them were able to say, you know, I'm just treated like a sort of a resource rather than a person. I've been sacked quite, you know, without notice, quite easily. I'm on short-term temporary contracts, and that's the way it is. And I think one of the things that came through from them was that they felt that this was something they had to accept because they felt they had no rights. That they were on short-term temporary contracts. As one person said, when you're on a temporary contract, you've pretty much got no rights. If they look at your contract, they can do whatever they want. And pretty much every job you get when you're our age, it's like that. You're on a temporary contract and they can just sack you whenever they want. So there's very little you can do about the situation. You'll see at the top of this slide what I've said here is that what I felt was in common between all the young people was a kind of passive acceptance. You know, what goes on in the workplace, I don't know that there's anything much I can do about it. You know, in terms of, yes, I have lots of issues at work. If I'm a young student, I do feel insecure, I do feel vulnerable to bad treatment. There's nothing I can do about it. Likewise, to some extent, the public sector. Some of them are union members, but still sort of feeling actually at the moment, not sure what we can do, this is inevitable, and there's really not a lot that we can do about it. And that was in a way what came through commonly from all three groups. As I said, what we did was to ask for people's top of mind reactions to when we say the words trade union. In fact, in previous research that I've done for TUC in 2005-2006, we'd actually asked people to draw pictures when we said the words trade union. And what we found was that these were kind of typical pictures that you get. Basically, two themes tended to come through. Either, as you'll see on the left-hand side here, when you say the words trade union, I haven't got a clue what you're talking about. So my picture is a load of question marks because these words mean nothing to me at all. Or, when you say the words trade union, what I think of is shipbuilders, miners, strikes, picket lines, braziers, and you know, disputes and conflicts and Thatcher and Scargill and those sorts of things. So that's historically what we found. Those consistently coming through from non-union members, research with non-union members. What we did this time actually was to ask people to do a kind of word association rather than draw a picture. And what we were hoping that we'd get from that is it would give us scope to get a wider range of associations than we can get from just drawing a picture, which takes people quite a bit of time. So what I asked people to do was, when I say these words, I want you to write down every word and phrase that comes into your head that you associate with these words. And then I said the words trade union and left them individually to write what came into their heads. A lot of what came through was specific companies, professions, industries, also a strong association with Labour, left-wing politics, and also, as with some previous research, that I don't know, I don't understand. Not a huge, actually in this case, not a huge number of the people, I mean this wasn't a numeric exercise, we didn't get much in the way of I don't know, I don't understand actually. It was only a few young people that really were perplexed when I said the word trade union and just wrote down, I don't know what you're talking about. So most of them could write something down beyond that, but we did get some of those sort of question mark type associations. So that was the kind of first element. The second element was quite a lot of quite positive associations, which obviously had rarely come through in the sort of pictures exercise that we've done in previous research. We had lots of things about ways of working, so resolution, negotiation, campaigning, those sorts of things, and sort of issues that trade unions might address. But we also had quite a lot of concepts, principles and values, things like security, togetherness, democracy, equality, fairness, support, being like-minded, knowledge, guidance, those sorts of words coming through in association with trade unions. So quite a lot of things that people felt were sort of positive aspects of the union movement. And actually, again, previous research that I've done with non-union members, the sense of collective strength was something that's tended to be very appealing within unions when you ask people about them. Not surprisingly, however, we did get quite a lot of negative and backward-looking associations again, and that's despite these all being 16 to 24-year-olds. The Scargill, Thatcher, 1980s miners' strike stuff coming through even from this young age group, none of whom were actually alive at the time, but especially that did come through in Sheffield, and people said, you know, people have got long memories up here, and we're all told about it. This is what people pass down, is that strike and what happened around here. We had a lot of mentions of strikes, conflicts, walkout, troublemakers, low morale, divided workforce, those sorts of words, and the sense that what unions are all about is disputes, conflicts, walkouts, industrial action, those kinds of things. And as one student put it, actually, they recognise that that's the only time that unions are ever in the media. That's the only time they ever come to light. One student said, they never really come to light unless there's a big, massive strike on or something bad happening. So you never really hear anything about them until it all goes wrong. You only see them in a negative light, really. I think Brendan Bullock mentioned this morning that one person had used the term bastards when we asked them with association, for word association, and what that was an association with disruption to his life. He said, I thought London Underground bastards, because unions, his association was, all unions are about is stopping me getting from where I need to get to where I need to go. Quite a number of negative associations were about, people use the term busybodies and scaremongers. And even in the public sector group, people talked about unions being afraid of change, a barrier to change, even if it's positive. One of the young people in Coventry said, they're afraid of change, I think, like they're immediately against change, and sometimes they're not that well informed. I think there's quite a lot of scaremongering that goes on. Another association, and again this had come through in previous research, bureaucracy, and young people feeling alienated from unions in the fact that they think of them as organisations with lots of minuted meetings, or as one person they said, they're the sort of people who say things like, it states at paragraph 3, line 2, that. And again, sort of that negative sense of formality, bureaucracy, and so on. One or two mentions also of them being a cost, something that's an expensive thing to join, and also one or two mentions of their organisations whose leaders are overpaid. So quite a lot of negative things coming through too. So I mentioned that we looked at barriers to unions and how to overcome them. Research sought to explore how young people feel about union membership, and these categories of sort of barriers, the key themes that come through, these are not how young people necessarily organise them, but looking back at all of the transcripts and research, I think you could pick out 4 clear themes that were sort of barriers to people wanting to join unions or the union movement. The first is simply lack of awareness, particularly in the private sector. Unions just not visible to young people, not seen as relevant to them. They would say, you know, I know teachers and doctors can join unions, but they're not in my workplace. I don't think they're relevant. At one I didn't realise you could be part of a union just for anything. And certainly there is a real lack of awareness and visibility, and also a lack of understanding. A lot of the young people say to me, I don't really know what they do. I don't really know what they're for. So, why would I join? I don't get what a union is. So some very basic understanding issues there, as I say, particularly in the private sector, and quite a lot of that coming through from the students as well. And obviously, workers in the public sector are much more knowledgeable about unions for obvious reasons. The second element is a kind of what I've called a lack of push factors. And this comes back to the issues about the sorts of passive acceptance of things going on in the workplace, and also to a degree in the private sector, actually being fairly content to accept things in the workplace. And I can go to my HR person, or I can go to my manager, and I don't really sort of see, I'm not worried about things, I'm not really particularly worried, so I wouldn't want to go and join a union because there's nothing for me to particularly worry about. Just to take that slightly further, one of the things that came through from young people was this idea that if I was worried, I'm not particularly worried about job security, and there was an assumption there that maybe that's what unions were really there to protect you for. I'm not worried about job security, not because it's not an issue, but because at my age I'm going to move around a lot anyway. And also at my age I don't have any dependents, so I haven't really got anyone to support. So, I think it might be something that I would worry about later, but right now, there's nothing making me want to join a union because I don't really need that protection. So that came through to some degree. The lack of pull factors, what I'm looking at there is really this sort of perception of unions as not having that much power, and again, sort of relates back to that passive acceptance. Well, I don't know why I joined a union because there's nothing much they can do to change things anyway. I think that unions aren't a particularly attractive place to go. I don't see what the benefits are of joining. I don't know what being part of a union would do for me. They can't achieve anything. And to some extent, again, coming back to the Shepherd Group, well, I don't have any rights. If I showed them my temporary contract, they just say, well, there's nothing you can do anyway, so why would I join the union? They can't help me. And then the last element is what I've called repellent factors, and there are quite a number of these, and they relate to negative perceptions that I've already mentioned. Costs are a repellent factor, you won't be surprised to know. Young people not earning a lot don't really want to spend money on something, but that's particularly in relation to not perceiving any real benefits for them. Very strongly, that unions are not for people like me, and again that relates back to previous research we've done, particularly with young women. Every time a union member is on the television, they don't look like me. Previous research I've done for TUC, we asked people to say what's a union member look like, and they tended to say, well, they're middle-aged, balding men who are angry about something. That's what a union member is like. So I don't see unions as an organisation that has people like me in it. The ideas of conflict and militancy and pettiness were another sort of repellent factor. I don't want to be part of something that's all about conflict, all about disagreeing with things, all about striking. I don't want any part of that. And therefore I don't want to be a part of that movement. And the other repellent factor, again, is that there was some reporting of kind of a fear of isolation. Well, I wouldn't do that because I'd be the only one who would do that. And that's scary. And in fact, there was even one young person who said, actually, if everyone else joined the union, I didn't, the managers would think I was great and I'd get promoted. So there's a sense that maybe there's actually advantages to not being part of a union in that sense. In terms of how you might deal with those things, and obviously lack of awareness and visibility, when we talked about what would overcome these things, young people said, well, obviously you've got to educate us, you've got to tell us, because we don't get it. You've got to start with the basics. Start with the basics. What is a union? What does it do? Who do they represent? How do they do it? What have they achieved? young people, particularly students, mentioned the importance of the NUS and the potential role the NUS could play, because when we talked about that, a lot of them were NUS members, but they didn't really associate NUS with unions in any way, shape or form, and then they sort of saying, well actually maybe when we stop being students, the NUS could have a role in pointing out that actually there are other unions and so on. So the NUS had a potential role to play there. In terms of lack of push factors, well obviously you can't go around creating sort of terrible situations in the workplace just so they feel vulnerable and then want to join a union because they're worried for their jobs. But you know, if actually they heard stories about young people who had been treated badly, one young person said, show people that companies can mess you about. Because some of them felt they'd never been messed about, but actually, you know, they heard stories that young people were being messed about, and that obviously that unions could help. One or two of them in the Sheffield group sort of suggested that unions could do something along the lines of those personal injury lawyer type adverts. You know, I fell over in the hallway and personal injury lawyers came and helped me. That it's those kind of, you know, scare us, make us realise that bad things can happen to us, and then we might be attracted to joining a union. Lack of pull factor is much more about, again, it's about telling stories of success, about making people realise there's benefits, making real stories of real young people who've genuinely shown how unions help them, but also make it more relevant to me. What can a union do for me? As one person says, what can a union do for me? I don't feel it affects me. And lastly, with the repellent factors, one of the things that young people talked about was the idea of creating some kind of peer pressure. The idea that young people might be much more attracted to joining if they were being asked to join in groups. And also that they wanted you, in a sense, to sort of communicate, make it feel like it was the norm for young people to be part of the union. One person said, make it seem more the norm for young people, with stats like 500,000 people under 25 are members of unions. Have you joined? That kind of thing. So creating kind of sense that it is something that young people do because they tend to follow each other. I had suggestions about drivers, free trial periods mentioned in a couple of groups. Why can't you have, when you first start work, you have a free year, see what it's like being part of the union, see what benefits you can get, and then they talked about mobile phone contracts. You automatically then start paying, and you forget to unjoin anyway, so that would be a good way of doing it. Perks and discounts. Lots of the students in particular and the young people who are working, who have been student members of the NUS, said that they only really joined, say, when they were in sixth form, the NUS, because they got discounts at Top Man or at this and that. You know, perks and discounts were quite appealing. Some of the literature and materials that we shared with them had some sort of discount schemes, membership scheme, and they did actually really like that. As long as they're relevant products and relevant services. Clear benefits through real life stories I've already mentioned, creating peer pressure I've mentioned as well, and also the reps, particularly for public sector workers, reps being people like me was also something that could potentially kind of address some of the effects. So whether you know, I'm sure you do want to have young reps, but that's what would appeal to young people. I mentioned that we shared some recruitment materials with them. We shared different materials in every group, and we didn't have long, so none of them were looked at in great detail. We could only really share written materials. I know that you do communicate with young people in lots of different ways, and not just with leaflets. But we just wanted to kind of get a general sense of how they reacted to various leaflets. The general reaction to leaflets was, as one person put it, when was the last time anyone read a leaflet? And they tended to think that. And also somebody said, you know, to be honest, most of these look like they belong in a doctor's surgery. Type of colours, format, something you read out of boredom when you're sitting in a hospital, rather than something you pick up because you really wanted to know what was in it. So I think that, you know, obviously that is a problem. But there were some guidelines, I think, that came through the research that maybe you can have a think about. One was not to assume any basic knowledge or understanding at all about unions. So some of the materials had the union's name on the front, and it said "Join Us," or you know, that would have just the union's acronym and you know, better together, or join us, or do this or that, you know. And that they were saying, well, I don't know what that was for. I just walked past it because I don't know what union is. So it needs to tell me what it does first, and don't assume that I know. And in actual fact, that chimes with some research that I did a few years ago for TUC and Community, where they'd had some leaflets going into Ladbrokes, and the Ladbrokes employers had all assumed these leaflets were actually being put out by their employer because they were about employment, and they didn't realise that Community was a union. They thought they were actually communications from the employer. So I think you know, that kind of thing can definitely happen in non-unionised environments where people just don't have any concept of what a union is. Standing out from the crowd, obviously something that appealed to young people, so something different, a slightly different format was welcomed. Integrated application forms were seen as a good thing in some of the leaflet materials, because what young people say is make it as easy as possible. In fact, one of them said, not only an integrated application form, you should have a pen attached, because otherwise we won't do it. You know. Making the benefits absolutely clear with real examples, real life stories, where that was in leaflets. They liked that because it got across. They sort of, yeah, actually, there's a real person. And discounts definitely did appeal. But the genuine sort of feeling was that actually, if you're going to recruit people, you need to get face to face with them, and you know, not rely on leaflets. And I know, you know, that won't be news to you, but the need for education and explaining, and this idea of encouraging group recruitment was something that they strongly felt was true. Finally, I'm going to come on to what they said about the cuts and the deficit, and their feelings about all of that. And I think they can be categorised into a few different thoughts and feelings. The first of these was that what happened when I started talking about this with them and raising the issues was that the groups all went a bit quiet, and people started to, as represented by my clam at the bottom there, they just started to clam up. And quite a large proportion of young people noticeably started to look really uncomfortable. And I think what was happening was articulated by one when I finally got them talking, was that he said, I may sound like a village idiot. And they just don't feel that they know enough to say anything that's you know, really intelligent and insightful about what's happening with the deficit, the economy, the cuts. They feel very confused, over confusion. And what they're saying is you hear different things. This quote here, even if you watch all the news and read all the papers, you get a different opinion from everything. So what's really going on? No one ever knows. It's so distorted. What are you supposed to think? So they do feel very confused about what's really happening. There was some evidence of just, again, a sense of passive acceptance. The cuts are going to happen. This is what we've been told must happen. And to some extent, you know, that is the acceptable. In fact, somebody did go as far as to say, you know, it's quite difficult for the government. They've got to make the cuts, and we're all in such a bad situation. I actually feel a bit sorry for them. It came out from one group. So actually, there was some evidence that quite a few of the young people have just said, oh, okay, yes, we've all got to accept that is what has to happen. They tend not to trust anyone to tell them the truth about the situation. Particularly politicians are not trusted to tell the truth. So they will blame, you know, this government blames the last government saying this government's doing it wrong. No one will tell them what the real truth is, and they don't sort of trust them. And in fact, they also don't know that the government knows what's happening. One person said, I don't even think the government knows what's going on. So, you know, no one really understands this situation. One student said, I definitely don't think I trust politicians at all. The people who are in government blame the last government blame the one before them. It's easy to do that because they're not in government anymore. And the other thing that came through was that they feel very powerless. They don't feel there's anything they can do to change the situation. They just have to wait and see how bad it is. In the public sector, you know, not any personal pain as yet, but just you know, I'm going to keep my head down, I'm going to wait and see what happens, and I don't really think there's an awful lot that I can do about it. As one private sector worker said, I think people have accepted it without wanting to. They've sort of been passive and taken it on and said, fine, we're in a recession, so what can we do? We did talk to them about fairness and what would fairness mean in the situation of the current deficit and the public sector cuts. And I think what was positive from the trade union movement's point of view is that when we asked them what would be fair, a lot of what came through from young people is actually a lot of what you will be trying to get across to young people. So what they said about fairness was people who are to blame for this situation should be asked to pay more, and bankers came through in every group. The banks and the bankers should be asked to contribute significantly. And so although, as I said, there was confusion about what had caused all this, when we asked them, you know, what would be fair, then the idea that bankers had in some way been part of the problem, they should be asked to pay, and that it wasn't fair for them to still be getting huge bonuses. That definitely came through from all three groups. That the rich should be asked to pay more in taxation, should take more of the burden than the poor. That the vulnerable should be protected, and that services for the vulnerable should be protected, although there was a lack of belief that that is what would happen, and concern that that isn't what was going to happen. They also raised the sense that waste and abuse in the system, you know, that they spontaneously raised ideas about, you know, there are people who are on benefits who are cheating, and that shouldn't happen, and that's not fair. Those sorts of things also came through. But actually, a lot of what they talked about, the concept of fairness, were messages that actually the TUC is putting forward. I would say as well, though, that they did say, well, there's no such thing as fairness, because what's fair to me isn't fair to someone else, and it's very indefinable. No one's going to agree, and if you're the person who loses out, you're never going to think it's fair anyway. So, I think that's a very quick run through of everything that we found across the three groups. I guess if I conclude, I think many of the barriers and perceptions that have been highlighted in previous research that I've done at the TUC's commission remain there, remain very strong and still true amongst this group. The recruitment strategies, I guess the big point I would emphasise is you need to start with the very basics and not assume any knowledge or understanding of what a trade union even is when you're trying to recruit. That's not to say that none of them understand it, but if you start with the basics, then you'll catch everybody. Some of them don't even understand that. There is a level of passive acceptance of workplace issues and a level of passive acceptance of the current governance issues and the current government's plan. Concepts of fairness seem to chime well with the TUC's values and approach, which is obviously, you know, a positive for you guys in terms of how you communicate over those things. And confusion over deficit is also coupled with cynicism and lack of trust in anyone to tell them the truth. And I would say I don't think that they'll necessarily trust the TUC to tell them the truth any more than they trust anyone else to tell them the truth. I hope you found it an interesting run through what I found. There is, as I say, as well as the interim report that you've already got, a more detailed report that's also going to cover their views about the deficit and the economy and the cuts, which will be coming out in the next couple of weeks. I'm very happy to take questions.